My fellow Americans, I come before you tonight as a candidate for the vice presidency and as a man whose honesty and integrity has been questioned.
All right, everybody, welcome back to The Brothers McDonough. We are in Season 1, Episode 4. Who would have believed that we would make it this far?
I sure didn't.
So, The Brothers McDonough, I'm Mark McDonough.
And I am David McDonough.
And we are
2/3 of
The
Brothers McDonough. First of all, Mark, I'd like to get a shout out to our sponsor. Did you know we have a sponsor now?
No, I didn't know that.
Yes, it's the Meadow Soprano School of Parallel Parking. Are you always crushing your hubcaps up against the curve while you listen to Journey? Don't be late for dinner with your family at the diner. You might miss something. Call 1-800-WACK-TONY.
There you go. Excellent sponsorship. So we're 2/3 of the Brothers McDonough. We just want to give a shout out to our older brother, Michael, who, as we like to say, is in a better place.
Ohio.
So, for those of you, and we hope there's at least a few of you who have been following along, episodes 2 and 3 were a tremendous travelogue and trip through the life of Cardinal Richelieu.
Yes, we're going to move from a time where politics was murder to a time where politics was a little more warm and cuddly.
Oh yeah, Richard Nixon. Nothing says warm and cuddly like Richard Nixon.
Or a Cocker Spaniel who changed history.
That's right. So, Dave, I guess we should probably kick off today with just sort of acknowledging Richard Nixon. Obviously, most people know him for his ultimate turn at the presidency and his fall through Watergate. But, it's easy to say that politically speaking, Richard Nixon was probably the largest figure in our sort of upbringing.
Nixon loomed large in our upbringing. Growing up in Ohio, we were a Republican family. And Nixon was a huge figure in our household. When he had to resign, it was a traumatic experience for us. I remember my sister, Amy, telling me that Nixon was in trouble. And I said, no, that's not true. And she goes, no, there's a man who says he has proof Nixon did something wrong. That man was John Dean. Mark read John Dean's book. I read about 100 pages of it and put it down.
Yes, that was Blind Ambition by John Dean.
Yes.
Which was a fascinating thing. But, so everybody sort of, most people who are familiar with Nixon, more modern young people, might have just a general sense of Watergate, but Richard Nixon had a career that had sort of more ups and downs than a roller coaster at Six Flags.
Oh, my goodness. Richard Nixon, they just kept knocking. I know there was a comedian who once said they just kept knocking Richard down. And he kept crawling his way back up to the top. I would not wish that roller coaster ride on anybody. And again, if you lived through our 2-part Richelieu thing, relax.
That's right.
There won't be any botched executions this time around.
That's right.
But it was still pretty nerve-wracking for American politics.
So, just a quick review for everybody. Nixon, born in California from a middle-class family. Interestingly, he grows up as a Quaker.
Yes. Now, his parents made him go to a Quaker meeting twice a week, or twice on Sunday. And when we say middle class, it was a pretty rough upbringing. They were running a grocery store, like a mom and pop grocery store. And Nixon's, according, in the speech that we're talking about today, mentioned that he spent a lot of his childhood working in that grocery store. So in a way, he was kind of like a hard-scrabbled Dobie Gillis.
Good Lord.
And his father was just as mean as Dobie Gillis's father, apparently.
Don't date us that far back in time.
I wasn't there for the Obie Gillis or Nixon's speech. But anyway, yes, he grew up kind of in a very modest, I would say modest upbringing in Whittier, California.
And one of the sort of interesting facts you mentioned when we were prepping for this was the fact that as a Quaker, let me just add an additional piece. He marries his wife, Pat, who will become very integral in the Checkers the Dog's speech in 1940. And of course, war breaks out at the end of 1941. And Nixon joins the Navy in 1942.
And he didn't have to. He had an exemption because he was a Quaker. He did not have to fight in the war. He did not have to prove he was a conscientious objector. Hey, I was going to a Quaker meeting twice a day. Was good. So was that Elvis or Nixon?
That's what I was going to say.
So he, according to John Dean's book, if memory serves me correctly, he was in some boring job in Washington in the Office of Price Control for tires or something like that, and he waived his exemption, joined the Navy, and served in the South Pacific in the Solomon Islands.
So Nixon serves. He comes out. He practices law for a little while, but he's got the political bug, so he becomes a congressman. And I got to tell you, folks, if you've ever seen Richard Nixon, he's not the most sort of photogenic, attractive guy. Has kind of a weird speaking sense to him, but he is effective, and he wins a seat in Congress, and then in 1950 he's elected to the Senate in California.
Now, I believe the lady that he beat in the Senate race, if memory serves me correctly, was a lady named Douglas, her last name, and he really did some dirty politics in that. He claimed that she was a communist sympathizer and called her the pink lady and said that she was pink right down to her underwear. Now, that's some major mudslinging there.
Yeah, for that time, certainly.
Yeah.
By the way, this is a precursor to the weird ups and downs you'll see with Nixon. He sees himself as a very honest, integrity-ridden guy, but he certainly wasn't afraid to engage in shenanigans.
Yes, shenanigans is a good word for it, since his wife was Irish Catholic before she married him. But anyway, just an overall view of Nixon and how large he loomed in American politics before we get to the speech that saved his career. He was vice president under Eisenhower for 8 years. Eisenhower, who had a heart attack and a stroke while he was president, sent Nixon all over the world. And these weren't fool's errands. He sent Nixon to Vietnam to meet Bao Dai, who was the emperor there. Ironically, Nixon wrote in his journal, well, if anybody can run this place, it's communists. After he saw the people who were on our side. And he sent Nixon, I believe Nixon went down to Latin America when there was a lot of trouble down there in one of the countries. I can't remember if it was Brazil or Colombia. Nixon famously had this so-called kitchen debate with Khrushchev, and it was just hilarious. Where they were, Khrushchev was saying, "Oh, we're gonna fly past capitalism and wave bye-bye," and Nixon's got this grin on his face, like, "Not if I can help it."
I tell you what's funny. The New York Post would become key in the Checkers speech, and we, of course, know the New York Post is famous for its headlines. So I suspect that Nikita Khrushchev thing might have been the fight over the Frigidaire.
Yeah. So Nixon, after he was vice president for 8 years, he lost a bitterly contested presidential race against JFK. I heard, and I don't know what's true or not, but I heard that in Chicago they rose from the dead to vote for JFK. Speaking of shenanigans, I believe that there were plenty to go around in that election. And the vote was extremely close.
Well, you know the Irish, vote early, vote often.
Yeah, and they never quit, as we'll find out later. So Nixon could have asked for a recount in the 1960 election. He did not, because he didn't want the moniker of sore loser to follow him. Interesting, one of the things that hurt Nixon during the 60 election was television and his failure to, not wearing makeup at the debate with John F. Kennedy. It seems like television was the enemy of Nixon, most of us think of. But we're going to find out in a minute that in some cases, television was Nixon's friend.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's going to be one of the things we would sort of point out for folks is the juxtaposition. The Checker speech 100% saves his career, gets him on the ticket as the VP, or keeps him on. And then seemingly the debate in 60 ends his aspirations to be president.
Now, in fairness, most gentlemen standing next to JFK are not going to win that beauty contest. And Nixon once quipped that, well, my mother said you boys better work hard in school because you aren't going to get anywhere in your looks. And he kind of laughed at his own joke. So, he was up against a lot there, standing next to JFK.
And then he loses the 1962 election to run for governor in California.
I believe it was in 1962 that Nixon made one of the most famous and self-pitying Nixon quotes of all time. And there's plenty to choose from. Where he said to the press something to the effect of, just think of all the fun you guys are going to miss. You won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore. And later, when Gerald Ford was president, and he kept falling down the stairs, and it was when Gerald Ford left office, they showed Gerald Ford all beaten up saying, just think, Gerald Ford won't have himself to kick around anymore. But anyway, I'm getting off topic.
By the way, I just have to tell you a funny anecdote. So later, when Nixon is running for president, and his animosity with the press will continue to loom large. And so his people say to him, you've got to be human and meet with the press. So he's staying in a hotel and they make this decision to have him meet with the press around the pool of the hotel. But the thing is, so they gather up the press on one side of the pool. Nixon comes down to the pool deck, or at least this is how I remember the story. And he's in wingtips and a suit at the pool. And he walks across the other side, across this gigantic pool and waves at the press hi guys, and then walks out and they're nah, that's not what we had in mind, Mr. President. Sort of offhandedly waving to them, but he was so awkward that he couldn't get near him.
Well, he went to, for a while, he was in, for a while he lived in California, but then after losing the election in 1962 for the governorship, I think he might have lost to Jerry Brown. I never checked that out.
Oh, that's a good question. We'll have to
the older Jerry Brown. Jerry
Brown.
Moon
Unit Jerry Brown?
Not Moon Unit Jerry. Not Spaceship Earth Jerry Brown, but his dad. I think. Weren't they father and son?
Yes, I believe so.
Well, we didn't have to research that, folks, because it wasn't part of today's. But anyway, so Nixon moves to New York and he gets a job with a Wall Street firm and he's making bank, ladies and gentlemen. Then,
which, by the way, will become very important when we go through Checkers, because in the Checkers speech, he very much talked about how he was not making
bank. So, but if you're a former vice president and every Republican in the country owes you a favor, and you're working for the Wall Street law firm, I don't know what he made, but my understanding was he was making some pretty good money in the 60s, but then tragedy struck the Kennedys, and there was JFK was assassinated tragically in 1963. Yep. Nixon, no way he was going to run for president in 1964. He let Goldwater get that trouncing. But 1968 was his year.
Yeah, I mean, and frankly, as you look at the ebb and flow, and we won't go into too much political analysis, But with the Vietnam War raging on and Johnson sort of struggling with that fact, the Democrats were very much in disarray as they hit their convention in '68 with the protests in Chicago and Mayor Daley, and so the door really to revive Nixon's career gets opened.
When a guy like Johnson, who won 3-1 against Goldwater in '64, goes on television in '68 and says, "I'm not running." Things are bad for the Democrats. You had George Wallace, who was running, and he's going to take all those Southern votes away from the Democrats. Hubert Humphrey refused to say that he would stop the war in Vietnam. He, I don't know if he believed that we needed to stay in or if he was just trying to uphold Johnson's legacy. But in any case, Democrats were a mess. And Humphrey, the guy that they picked, is getting shouted down at the convention. There's a riot outside the convention, of protesters. And Nixon walks away with the election of '68. Doesn't walk away with, but he wins decisively.
So by the way, I'll give you a small digression, and I will plug Doris Kearns Goodwin's book on leadership, of which, interestingly, and she's a big Johnson person. She worked in his administration, so it's not totally surprising. But first off, it's a great book, but she also gave a lot of back. Like, Johnson had a lot of weird, I don't want to say weird insecurities, but like a lot of baggage that he carried with him. And I think as he goes into that election, he just decides, I'm going to be an anchor to the party and we can't win. I don't know about whether you say fortunately or unfortunately, but I'm not sure, probably yes, he was right in that regard. But what he was leaving, the people he was leaving to run were in no way, shape, or form equipped to pick up the pieces and sort of head back.
I'm amazed, though, at how much legislation Johnson got through. He was a master parliamentarian, and then all of a sudden he's like, I can't take it anymore. I'm leaving.
Yeah. So, frankly, he'd had heart attacks but and again, this is another podcast for another time. Yeah. If you're a history buff, I never gave Johnson enough credit. And I always sort of understood he was a much more effective president than Kennedy in terms of legislation. Mm-hmm. He was beyond masterful, which is interesting as we get back to Nixon because, what's your take on Nixon's sort of intellectual overall capacities?
I think Nixon was brilliant. I think that I don't think anybody was as smart as James Garfield.
Yeah.
I think Nixon was a brilliant poker playing kind of leader. I think that he understood how to get things done with diplomacy. I'm not crazy about what he did in Cambodia, but he knew how to leverage. He knew how to leverage his visit to China to put pressure on the Soviet Union. I may have it wrong, but my understanding was the Soviets did not want to sign the SALT Treaty, but when he visited China, that was used as leverage to get them to sign the SALT Treaty. That may not be true, but hey, he got the Soviets to sign the SALT Treaty. He also, we remember him as the guy who went to China. He created the EPA.
Yep.
And to answer your question, I would say that he was very brilliant. One of the smartest guys who was ever in the White House.
By the way, I'm going to give 2 plugs now. Episode 1, James Garfield, perhaps the most brilliant. Lincoln obviously is off the charts in just general brilliance, but Garfield, really brilliant guy. And then the other disclaimer that we'll have here is that saying when Dave says he wasn't thrilled by what went on in Cambodia, he means he's very much against war crimes. He was horrified by what went on in Cambodia.
I'm not thrilled by the war crimes that were committed there.
And we don't want to downplay the descent sort of into hell that Nixon took through Watergate.
Yes.
For a guy, which makes maybe if you understand him deeper how shocking Watergate is, that he is really next level at diplomacy and thinking about the environment and all these things, and working with a Democratic Congress, which never happens anymore. And yet he was just going bonkers, basically.
Right. Nixon inherited, like you said, a Democratic Congress. So instead of fighting it, he worked with them to get things done. He created the EPA. At the time, in 1969, I think it was the same year as Chappaquiddick, so I think it was 69. The Cuyahoga River, that we grew up near, because we're from Cuyahoga Falls, burst into flames. It wasn't the first time that happened. The Cuyahoga River caught on fire many times in the 20th century, but that time was a time that people noticed because the environment was very important in the 1960s.
And by the way, for the record, it was the tires floating on the top of the water that catch.
Well, I think it was the oil
and the chemicals.
Down where we were, the river didn't catch on fire. It was up in Cleveland.
But I still swam in it, which horrified Mom.
The Cuyahoga. I hear it's cleaner now.
It's actually gorgeous. I took the kids back to Cleveland, and we sort of went down to the gorge and looked around, and it's really, really beautiful.
Oh, that's nice. Well, it certainly was a scary place to live next to when we lived there.
And by the way, folks, the reason our mother was so horrified when I told her my friends and I had gone down swimming in the Cuyahoga River is because we had a pool in our backyard. And she was like, "What is wrong with you, boy?"
I want to swim in the filth, Mom.
I want to go into politics.
He's got a healthy green glow, though. Anyway, so he created the DEA. You can decide whether or not that was a good thing. But people were terrified of, marijuana and LSD in 1968. He created the Environmental Protection Agency.
To your point, I think the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act come through with the EPA.
Yep.
And probably the National Environmental Policy Act, I think, also. So major environmental
he was a
legislation.
You look at the guys. Well, yes, he was a great environmental president. We'll leave it at that. It's kind of like Clinton had a Republican Congress, so he kind of had to go right to get things done. Nixon had a Democrat Congress. He moved to the left and got things done, but he accomplished a lot when he was president. Some good things, some not so good things. But he was a giant in the field of politics, bought down by one of the
pure folly,
dumbest things that you can imagine.
So we'll save another day to go into the particulars of Watergate for those of you who are interested. Keep in mind that the Watergate break-in, they actually broke in twice. They got away with the first one. They got caught on the second one, but we digress.
Well, they had a good reason for going back. There was like a screeching sound, and they couldn't hear what political mastermind George McGovern was up to.
That's right. That's probably...
Never underestimate George McGovern. The man he's a casual. I'm just kidding around. Poor George. He was a good man.
So we'll just wrap up on Nixon's career to say the shocking thing about Watergate is that Nixon wins in a landslide. There was no need for anything they did around Watergate. It was complete folly on their part. He was worried about losing the election. There was zero chance he was going to lose that election. And then secondly, as we mentioned, for those who are into politics and sort of involved in the 70s, Nixon created this incredible hangover for American presidential politics that lasted a decade, and Americans, it made deeply suspicious of the president and all sorts of things.
So,
meanwhile, back at the Checkers speech.
Yes, how a Cocker Spaniel saved a much younger, much less known Nixon career. We have to go on the Wayback Machine to the year 1952. Now, Mark, what do you know about conspiracy theories?
Well, Dave, I try not to let any of them penetrate my foil hat, so I don't know that much.
Well, it may interest some of our listeners, if any of our podcast listeners, all 15 of you, if any of you know anything
15? Wow, aren't you optimistic?
Hey, I'm going to live high on the hog on this. Once we get that mezzo-soprano money. You may have heard of the Bohemian Grove. This is where Nixon meets Ike. It was 1950. So Nixon was still I guess he was running for Senate.
He was running for Senate in 50.
Hoover invited, apparently, Nixon and Eisenhower, or at least he invited Eisenhower. Anyway, Nixon was at Bohemian Grove. For those of you who are conspiracy theorists and listen to Alex Jones, you know about Bohemian Grove, but that's where Nixon met Eisenhower of all places. I don't. Just for the record, I do not buy into any of Alex Jones' cuckoo conspiracy theories. But anyway, I thought it was funny that they met there. In 1952, both the Democrats and the Republicans want Ike. They both like Ike. So which one was he going to be, Mark? Was he going to be a Democrat or a Republican?
Well, a bit of a jump ball. I think people don't quite appreciate the fact that Eisenhower could have ended up running on the Democratic ticket, but it doesn't work out that way.
No, he declares himself a Republican, and he wins the nomination by acclamation. And Eisenhower is being he's a big war hero, but he's not a political ideologue.
Right.
And he's not, the hardcore Republicans, like the really conservative ones, they like guys like Taft from Ohio. Very conservative. They're not crazy about, I'm sure they love Eisenhower because he was the big war hero and he's a shoo-in to win the election, but maybe they're a little worried about him being too liberal, and they choose Nixon, 39 years old, a veteran of World War II, a Navy guy. He's married. He's famous because he got Alger Hiss, who was convicted of perjury, not espionage. Is that right? Yeah, he was convicted of perjury.
Yeah, that's my understanding.
I believe he lied about knowing Whittaker Chambers.
Whoops.
Look, folks, I know you're thinking about going bad and turning to a life of crime. Don't lie about knowing Whittaker Chambers. It's not worth the time that you'll have to do. But anyway, I think he might have been. What's the word I'm looking for? Not redeemed, but not justified, but
acquitted or
no. Later
exonerated.
in life, later in life, I think that
Alger
they found that
Hiss
Alger Hiss was in fact a Russian spy. Like, didn't that come out at some point? Like, he was convicted, and people thought he was part of the Red Scare, and then years later, at the end of the Cold War, when
it turns out they were right.
I think that came out. Like, Alger Hiss was a Russian asset. So there you go. I guess, I am losing 10,000 brain cells a day, ladies and gentlemen, and I cannot think of the word that I'm looking for. Justified, exonerated, proven right. Proven right. Well, I guess Nixon was proven right. We'll have to go with that. Anyway, so he's a vet, and also he's a resident of California, which is an electoral jackpot. So Nixon is chosen as Eisenhower's running mate. Eisenhower's not really crazy about Nixon for whatever reason. I think my brother is looking up to find out if Alger Hiss was guilty or not.
Using Mr. Google to say.
These are well rehearsed, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, I'll have to confirm that later.
Yeah. Okay. So, Eisenhower's not crazy about Nixon, but, I believe that he had no reason to want to dump him from the ticket. He was chosen, except a problem arises.
Yes. So the New York Post, that incredible hotbed of great journalism, publishes, I think it's around September or August of
September 19th.
September 19th. They publish an article about an $18,000 fund that is set up by some of Nixon's supporters.
Yes.
And this becomes kind of ironically, perhaps, or I mean, maybe not ironically is the way to put it, kind of shockingly, this becomes a big issue because, as you learned during the course of the Checker speech, like everybody had one of these funds.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is, well, first of all, the New York Post today is very much a right-wing paper. In those days, apparently, it was very much a left-wing paper, but their journalism was about the same level.
Oh, by the way, just to finish that thought, the $18,000 fund was supposedly funneling money to Nixon, and there was some implication of whether A, it was secret, B, it was personal funds to sort of supplement his income, and this becomes the catalyst for the speech.
Well, I was just about to get to that. The headline in the Post was something to the effect of "secret fund discovered."
Right.
So when you read about a secret $18,000 fund, that becomes a scandal. And even if there's nothing actually illegal about it, it gains traction. And it's gaining traction because Eisenhower and Nixon are running on a ticket to clean up the corruption in Washington. Ladies and gentlemen, Harry Truman was an honest man, about as honest a man as you can get.
Yep.
But some of the people in his administration
were less honest.
Not so honest. I mean, Tom Pendergrass made Truman. Truman was still an honest man. He went to Tom Pendergrass' funeral because Pendergrass was a friend of his. But I think he was the only guy from the whole Pendergrass machine who wasn't dirty. But there were plenty of scandals all around Truman, even if he himself. Ladies and gentlemen, someone just called in to tell me that the word of the day is vindicated, which was actually the word I was looking for a moment ago when perhaps Nixon was vindicated in going after Alger Hiss, since Alger Hiss supposedly was considered a Russian asset when the Cold War ended and we were able to find out about these things. But anyway.
And the reason we're obsessing about that a little bit is because he mentions Hiss repeatedly in the speech.
And the reason I'm obsessed with finding the right word is, when you get to be my age and you walk into a room and you don't remember why you walked in, and as George Carlin famously said, a word goes through your mind. Alzheimer's. So I had to come up with that word. Sorry. Okay. So anyway, this $18,000 supposedly secret, but it wasn't really a secret fund. Even though it's probably not a real scandal, it's more like a manufactured one. Nevertheless, it's gaining traction. And Eisenhower makes it clear that he would like Nixon removed from the ticket.
Yeah.
He doesn't tell Nixon that he should resign, but he makes it clear by telling all of his aides. And a lot of the aides around Eisenhower are thinking, if Eisenhower doesn't want him on the ticket and this thing becomes a real scandal or a perceived scandal, then we need Nixon off the ticket.
And this is not a highly procedural action at that time in politics, right? Eisenhower can find another. There wasn't been a huge primary where Nixon's been on it, been sort of voted into this position. They can swap him out if they really want to. But Ike is he doesn't go hard at it, right? He doesn't demand they take Nixon off.
Mm-hmm.
He leaves some wiggle room open for Nixon to save his hide.
He does. And never underestimate Richard Nixon.
Wow.
Because the RNC and two other GOP entities, I believe the Republican Senatorial Committee and the Republican Congressional Committee, sponsor 30 minutes of airtime on national television. Now, in 1952, you didn't have a lot of choices. You had professional wrestling or roller derby. I don't even know what they had in 19. This was before the Honeymooners was even on the air.
I think so. But it is kind of amazing, the idea that the candidate for vice president will buy a national spot for 30 minutes to talk about a scandal.
Yes, and it's on the radio too. It's nationally broadcast.
So one of the interesting things is they decide to do it in Los Angeles. They build an entire set. Like, they don't go to his house and they don't go to like a library or something. They literally build a sound studio. I guess probably because cameras weren't mobile back then.
Yeah.
So they build this fake room in Nixon's house on the set of the studio.
It's Tinseltown. Everything's on a soundstage. So our boy Nixon comes out to talk about the fund. And interestingly, right off the bat, what does he say, Mark?
Well, it is very interesting. First off, maybe I'd note, if you watch the entire video, they sort of set it up like it's some sort of breaking news. Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Nixon's, going to speak to the nation.
Yeah, right. They show an American flag waving.
And Nixon starts right out, and, to his credit, I'm not sure who exactly was advising him or helping him write this, but he says, normally people would just ignore something like this, but we're not going to sweep it under the rug. And then, almost more shockingly, particularly since we've seen so many politicians sort of ignore the idea of whether they've done something wrong, right? He lays out the fact he's been accused of this, and he says, now, was that wrong? And let me say that it was wrong.
Wow.
I'm saying it, incidentally, that it was wrong. Not just illegal, because it isn't a question of whether it was legal or illegal. That isn't enough. The question is, was it morally wrong? And for people who are into political communications, this is a beautiful pivot.
Yep.
Nixon has said 3 things. 1, I was wrong, but I wasn't illegal.
Mm-hmm.
And then he tees up the question of, but could it be immoral? And he pivots around, and lo and behold, it's not immoral.
Why isn't it immoral, Mark, or Mr. Nixon?
Well, I need to tell you, Dave. Sorry, we grew up on Saturday Night Live imitations of Nixon. He says, there are 3 things that would make it immoral: if I had personal gain, if it was done in secret, or if I gave special favors. And then the whole speech, or this part of the speech, starts down a launch of discrediting these 3 ideas, right? And the secret thing, he says, well, I talked openly about it at Meet the Press with one of the guys from Meet the Press, so, I wasn't hiding it from anybody.
Yeah, it's not secret.
Yeah. And then he says, this is brilliant. He says, I'm a senator, so if I go to visit, like if somebody calls me and says, hey, I need a special favor with the Veterans Administration, I would go to the Veterans Administration, and the administration, a Democratic administration, would have all the records to prove that I went and inappropriately visited these agencies.
There you go.
And then he gets to the tricky part. Is there any proof of personal gain? And wow, do we go down a rabbit hole in this 30-minute speech.
First, he goes to Price Waterhouse. That was before it was Price, Waterhouse, Coopers, and Lybrand. I don't even know if they're in business anymore. And some other independent auditing company. And they do an independent audit of the fund and what it was spent for, and they said that he didn't use it for his own personal use.
And in the speech, he decides to go through basically an entire biography, which is really bizarre, right? He's going to prove to everybody that he didn't get any money to gain. I'm not really sure why the Price Waterhouse audit, like he doesn't explain. He keeps saying it's an independent audit. But he says, I'm just going to recount to you my personal finances, which will prove I didn't gain from it, which is a little like, okay, so there's not like a bag of money stuffed in your mattress that you may have conveniently left out, but whatever. But then he says, I'm going to start in 1913, in Whittier, I think it is, California. And he just goes on this weird trip through his life.
Yes.
And ultimately, I say weird, but as you and I sort of discovered in this, he has 3 pieces. He has facts, he has politics, and he has emotion.
Yep.
And he goes on that cavalcade because that's the emotion part.
Yes. One of the interesting facts which is kind of also mixed up with politics, is he says the $18,000 was to cover expenses that should not be charged to taxpayers.
Yeah.
This money is so that you don't have to pay for stenographers. And Mark, sometimes people put their wives on the payroll as stenographers.
Yes.
But not Richard Nixon.
No. Although, what do we know about Pat Nixon, Dave?
We know that she's an excellent stenographer and taught it in high school.
That's right. He goes on and on about Pat. By the way, Pat Nixon is sitting immediately to his left, our right, and at I think 2 points in the speech, maybe 3, they kind of either pan to her or they just focus in on her, and she looks like somebody sealed her in urethane, and she is just staring at him with this bizarre smile on her face in an armchair just off the side where he's giving the speech.
We're talking Macy's mannequin in the women's dress wear department.
Which is funny because Nixon kind of shows some emotion throughout the speech. He smiles at times. He gets up and gives a stump speech sort of at the end. Yeah. Not Pat. She's frozen in time.
So this was a masterful mixture of substance and emotion. He does find ways to backhand all of his political opponents. He mentions that Mr. Sparkman, the guy running for vice president it was Adlai Stevenson and Sparkman. Mr. Sparkman was I believe the gentleman running for vice president with Adlai Stevenson. He mentions that Mr. Sparkman has his wife on the payroll as a stenographer. And then he's quick to say, no, I don't condemn him for doing that. That's for you to decide. But I just don't feel the taxpayers should be paying. There's so many stenographers who need a job that they could be paid for with my contributors. I believe that's how he coached it.
And he whips rocks at multiple people at this and repeatedly says, but I'm not condemning them for doing it.
I'm not condemning the Democrats or Mr. For whoever. One of the symbols of corruption in the Truman administration was the mink coat affair. And apparently Loretta Young, who was a stenographer, and the wife of E. Merle Young, who was in charge of the RFC, received a mink coat gift. And this be a very expensive one. I believe it was over $4,000, which was a lot of money back then to buy a coat. And this was a big scandal that embarrassed the Democrats. At some point in Nixon's speech, he doesn't bring up Loretta Young. He doesn't bring up E. Merle Young. He doesn't bring up the fact that E. Merle Young's wife is a stenographer.
Right.
He just says, after he goes on this big, long, should we go over this list of expenses that Nixon mentioned or just say a little more before we get to this?
I think we can suffice to say he literally goes down to how big his mortgages are.
I owe this much money to my parents because they lent me money.
I have a $500 loan against my life insurance policy.
I have no life insurance on Pat or my 2 daughters. He basically gives you his entire financial disclosure.
Which, by the way, doesn't actually prove anything that he's not taking bribes.
Not if they're giving him cash. But he's claiming, well, how do you know that there isn't some cash you don't know about? And then but by now, emotionally, you're with this man.
Yeah.
He's a veteran. People are picking on him. People are slandering him. He keeps saying this is a smear. And when he lists an itemized list of every dollar he has, you just start to trust him.
Right.
So at one point he says, without mentioning the name of the people in the scandal or the mink coat scandal, he just says offhand, my wife Pat doesn't have a mink coat because, they're poor and they're hard scrabble. Right. She has a respectable Republican cloth coat. And thus he brings up the mink coat scandal without bringing up the mink coat scandal.
Yeah, this is definitely a deft piece of writing for all the bizarreness of Nixon pulling it off. The other thing, by the way, the reason we brought up Alger Hiss so much is because he continues. He has two major themes of the CCs against the Democratic ticket: communism and corruption. Communism and corruption. He just hammers them all through. That's the other political part of this speech.
I'd like to say that the next thing he does after he goes down the financial rabbit hole is he turns the tables on his opponents and says, well, I believe now that there are, this is a fund, and I've explained it, and I believe that there was some other funds. I believe that there was he points a finger at Stevenson. Adlai Stevenson is running for president against Eisenhower, and claims that there was a fund where they gave money to state employees. And he wants, not only, he goes one extra mile here and says, I'm not condemning these state employers or saying that they did anything wrong, but until we know the facts, there's doubt. And he says, everyone, Stevenson and Sparkman, should disclose their entire financial all of their finances as I've done.
So, at that moment, do you believe that Ike spit his Manhattan he was sipping on at home as he watched the speech out? Because Ike didn't love that line, did he?
No, as I learned later now, there was a gentleman who wrote a book, Ike and Dick, named Jeffrey Frank, and the book is about the entire relationship from beginning to end between Eisenhower and Nixon. And apparently Eisenhower wasn't crazy about Nixon saying, we all should do what I'm doing. Because apparently Eisenhower didn't really want to go on TV and tell disclose all his stuff. But it really didn't matter. Eisenhower needn't have worried. No one was going to ask him to do anything. The fact that Nixon did it and challenged Stevenson to do it made Stevenson it just basically gave him a moral upper hand, or appeared to have a moral upper hand.
So now we've moved pretty much through about 18 minutes of the speech, of the 29-minute speech, and this is where Nixon delivers the dog moment. He tells a story. I should mention one other thing because, the evil people on the other side are going to bring it up if I don't mention it. But Pat and I did receive a gift.
A gift? Oh no, he really is corrupt.
He says, Pat was stumping with Nixon, for the election, and she was interviewed on the radio, and she made an offhand comment that the girls, Trish and Julie, I believe, wanted a dog.
A man down in Texas heard Pat on the radio mention the fact that our two youngsters would like to have a dog.
And some guy in Texas takes it, crates up a black and white spotted Cocker Spaniel.
Can you do that?
That's right.
I guess you can.
Apparently, it made it safely to California because the Nixons, and he just literally describes we got a note at home and we went down to the post office and there was this starving dog from a crate, And they get this dog, and he's basically defiantly says, the girls named him Checkers, and they love him, and we're not giving him back.
And our little girl, Tricia, the 6-year-old, named it Checkers. And the kids, like all kids, love the dog. And I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep it.
One of the things we read was that Mimi Eisenhower was crying at the end of this speech. And
at which point I figure Ike is thinking, I guess he's staying on the ticket.
Yeah. So just a couple things about the end of the speech, I guess I would say. One, he gets very feisty.
Yeah.
Even standing up at one point. It becomes a political stump speech at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And he starts hammering more on Alger Hiss, and he says, I'm a fighter, and if people think I'm going to just dump from the ticket. And now comes what is really interesting is the dance between whether he was doing this speech to say, I'm resigning from the ticket.
But there's one more thing we got to cover. Because, yes, he is getting to that point, but after he gets you with the dog named that his little girl named Checkers, the dog, not the little girl, he did one more heartstring moment.
Oh, yes.
America was in a brutal war in Korea. It was the first time that, I believe it was the first time that we got into a major war without asking Congress to declare it.
Yeah.
Some historians still call it the Korean Action.
Police action was the phrase we heard oftentimes in history growing up.
People were not happy with this war, and Nixon reads a letter from a young 19-year-old woman who's a wife of a Marine corpsman serving in Korea. And my guess is she felt that the Eisenhower administration would help bring the war to an end.
Yeah.
I'm not really sure what the point was, but she sent $10 to Nixon's campaign. And Nixon, of course, being the upstanding guy he is, says, "This is a check I will never cash."
Yeah. Which then one says, "Oh, but you've cashed a bunch of other checks." But anyway.
Only from wealthy donors.
But it is that's probably more so than the dog.
Yes.
The thing that got Mimi Eisenhower probably crying was the sick, because, America had lost. It's interesting. He uses a casualty number of 174,000, which is total, like, wounded and dead. But in 3 years in Korea, I believe America lost about 60,000 deceased service members. And if you've ever read a book, and I recently read one on the Korean War, like, it was unbelievably horrific, the fighting in Korea.
It's our forgotten war.
Yeah.
Despite the popularity of shows like MASH, it's like this catastrophe that Americans forgot about.
And it's a crazy war. Like, we're on the defensive, like getting routed by the North Koreans at first because we throw into the war sort of, and then MacArthur pushes them way back with this crazy landing on Incheon, and then the Chinese enter the war. The Korean War is a crazy history. We'll probably do a podcast about it.
Oh my goodness. And it doesn't help the Democrats that, people don't want to blame their generals. They want to blame the politicians. And I'm not saying that Truman was wrong to fire MacArthur, but politically
it was fraught.
Caused them some headaches.
Oh, yeah.
Let's put
so,
it
I mean,
that
again,
way.
it's another sort of stroke of genius to read this letter and hold this check up in front of God and everybody. That's the new power of television, right? He holds the check up, folks, and then, like, waves it at the...
but oddly enough, we remember the dog. But, Mark, I interrupted you.
No, that's okay.
Let's bring it on home. Eisenhower's aides want Nixon off because Eisenhower wants Nixon off, and lo and behold, what happens?
So Nixon says in the end of the speech, "I know everybody's wondering, am I going to resign?" And he says, "I'm going to leave that decision to the RNC." And then he tells everybody watching, and we had, I think, 60 million viewers.
I believe it was, how many televisions were there in 1952? Maybe it was the 60 million that I heard might have been radio and television together.
True.
That's like 60 million was half the population.
And we should point that out. He acknowledges they broadcast this on radio and TV at that time.
And I'm sure it was replayed in sound bites.
So assuming 60 million people hear the speech in one manner or another, he says, "You, America, can control this. You need to let the RNC know
if I should stay or if I should
go." Now, we've heard different stories about whether Ike was like, "What?" or whether Ike was like, he was giving Nixon his chance to shoot his shot.
The way my history professor at St. Mary's College of Maryland, L. Tomlin Stevens, the way he presented this to us, and he played the speech, and he says, "Now, imagine Nixon's, all of Eisenhower's aides are saying, okay, good, now he's going to resign." And instead he says, "No, I'm not a quitter. Yeah. I'm going to ask you, the American people." And that's the way he built it up. I don't know if that's actually what was going on in the Eisenhower war room, as it were, while they were listening to this speech.
So, two interesting things. One is Nixon thinks the speech is a failure primarily because he runs out of time, and obviously they've bought a specific amount of time, and they literally, if you watch the speech, he's talking and they sort of run credits right over top of him, and he doesn't get to read out the RNC's address. So he thought, oh my God, nobody's going to know where to mail a letter.
I'm done.
That's it. But as it turns out, the RNC gets flooded with letters and emails. Listen to me, telegrams. Whack. Saying keep Nixon on the ticket. The other thing that's interesting, if you watch this, I think people sort of deride Nixon for this speech in the sense that it became the checkers speech, what a goofball,
how
talking about
hokey
his
and
dog.
nonsense.
I'm shocked it didn't become known as the I'm not a quitter speech.
Yeah.
Because he really is railing at the end of the speech that he's not going to quit, and he pulls one out of his hat. And, say what you want. It worked.
I kind of admire Nixon's ability to use a brand new medium, television, so effectively. And I mean, I think the Checker speech, and I had the same opinion when I first heard about the Checker speech. The lady who was the faculty advisor for the school newspaper, Brandywine, was talking about how much she hated Nixon.
That was our high school, by the way.
Yeah, her name was Miss Fitzgerald, and she said, "Oh, Nixon was always a bad person. Back in the 50s, he made this idiotic speech about a dog named Checkers." And that's when I first heard about it. Everybody tells me this speech was just a bunch of hokum and nonsense and sentimental baloney. This speech was a masterclass in political maneuvering. Certainly outmaneuvered the 5-star general. I'm a naval lieutenant, and I'm quoting something that the Jeffrey Frank said, the author of Ike and Dick. He said that when he was talking about the book once. But I mean, it was a combination of substance, because he did basically more or less prove that he didn't do anything illegal.
Yeah.
If you've ever read the book How to Make Friends and Influence People, I know Nixon read this book, because one of the chapters is if you do something wrong, get out in front of it and admit it.
Yeah.
He admits that it's immoral and wrong, and then he pivots and says, but it's not, because I didn't use it for my own personal good.
Right.
And then he goes from, I'm a victim, I'm being picked on, and then he says, yeah, we received a gift, a little dog named Checkers. Like, he goes for the heartstrings. Yep. Laugh at that if you will, but it worked. And then he says, they don't know who they're dealing with. I'm not a quitter. I'm fine. By now, it's just like when you go to see a movie, there's always a character that you root for. And in this 29-minute television program, the Richard Nixon Fight Comeback Show, you're rooting for Nixon by the end of the 29 minutes. You're like, yeah, get him, Nixon. And the next thing you know, you're going to Western Union to send a telegram to the RNC.
It is brilliant. Honestly, and maybe they do in like communications classes and things, but I'm a little surprised more. I mean, I suppose in this day and age with social media and all that, it wouldn't work. But as you said, for the time, he took this medium. And what makes it sort of amazing is how he then gets crushed.
How
years later
did a
in the
man
debates
go from using, and not everybody had a television in 1952. It was a new medium. How did he go from effectively using that medium in 1952 to having television hand him his rear end on a platter during his debate with Kennedy?
By the way, you told me an interesting fact about the debate between television and radio.
Yeah.
Do you recall what that was about?
Yes, I heard it on Larry King. So now you know how old I am. No. Years ago, somebody was on Larry King talking about Nixon, and so this is hearsay, not admissible in court. I always heard that they did a poll, and the people who heard the Nixon-Kennedy debate on the radio thought that Nixon won.
Yeah.
And the people who watched it on TV thought he lost. And basically what it boiled down to is Nixon refused to wear makeup because I guess he thought makeup, I don't know, maybe he thought it made him look like a sissy. He didn't seem to understand if you don't wear makeup on TV,
right,
you look like Marley's ghost,
right.
you know, and I think he was also sweating under the,
that's the other thing I heard is that
bad.
he was sweating profusely under the studio lights. And again, he's not directly under like debate lights. Like this is a set. They set this whole thing up for the Checkers speech.
Maybe they put makeup on him during the Checkers speech. I don't know much about television makeup. How he looked okay. Really? No, I don't. Despite my background in having no experience in television, no.
Once we get on YouTube, folks, this will all become very clear.
Yeah, that's right. It's amazing that he masterfully used television, and then television was his worst enemy. Just 8 years later, in 1960.
Wow.
There's one other thing I should point out.
Okay.
I watched years ago a PBS thing about Adlai Stevenson and how, well, actually, I think it was a thing about just how politicians were trying to adjust to television and how they were trying to master the medium. And they showed an excerpt of Adlai Stevenson talking on TV, and it was awkward and strange, it seemed. And he had some young guy on, and I don't know who the guy was, if it was like a relative or if it was like an aide or something. And this kid that he had on him was saying, "Well, gee, Mr. Stevenson, yeah, I sure like watching TV more than being on it." And it was just like painful to watch Adlai Stevenson on television. At that year, 1952, Nixon knew how to control the narrative. Good for him.
Yeah, and maybe we'll do a podcast at some point around just the change in like political campaigning from Washington, who basically did none, and then the bitter fights between Jefferson and Adams. How it goes on and on. The Lincoln Douglas debates, the Lincoln giving 3 hour speeches and or hours long speeches not being abnormal,
and people reading them in the newspaper because there was nothing to do back. They had no internet, no television, no radio.
The famous, they don't have a picture of Lincoln at Gettysburg giving the speech because it was so short. He turned, the guy didn't even set the camera up yet. But anyway, we can sort of dig into that, and God forbid us two old fogies try and talk about social media. But so that brings us to the end of episode 4.
The Cocker Spaniel who saved Nixon's career.
It's a catchy title, but we might shut it down just a little.
I would urge all of you to save money for retirement. No, just kidding. It's that. And I would urge all of you to, if you have time, watch the Checkers speech. It is amazing. I mean, even if you think it's a bunch of baloney, it's masterclass baloney.
Yeah.
I mean, it's 29 minutes. If for no other reason than to look at the mortified expression and the fake smile on Pat Nixon's face, as the entire world finds out how little money they have and how hard. Just according to Jeffrey Franks, who wrote the book Ike and Dick, might want to check that book out. He said that Pat Nixon was mortified, sitting there having to sit through this.
She looks mortified. She looks mummified, but she's probably mortified on the inside. The other thing that by the way, God bless you if you're enough of a presidential geek to want to watch this speech, but it is very interesting. And if you have a few minutes to just sort of see it, it's a seminal moment in a major ebb and flow of political life.
And it's weird seeing Nixon so young.
Yeah.
Even though he was 39 at the time.
Right.
We think of him as the old worn out guy who was saying, I'm not a crook.
Yeah, that's right. So, thank you all for listening. We would ask that you give us a rating of 4, 5, 10, 20 stars, whatever you're capable of
Well,
giving.
it depends on the scale, Mark.
And
If it's between 1 and 100.
that's true. Like, subscribe, do whatever that type of stuff is that you could do. You understand it better than we do, hopefully. And we will be back soon. The next episode deals with another very oddly forgotten war.
Dun, 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 dun. Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. Britons never, never, never will be slaves. It's weird to hear that from an Irishman, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very weird. And so that gives you a little bit of idea. We abused the poor French with Gardner Reesley.
Yeah.
We're gonna come back with a much shorter but fascinating tales of another politician early in their career. And
Who is that
forgotten
politician? Should
war.
we tell them or should we let them wonder?
I guess we can let the cat out of the bag, or in this case, the British bulldog,
The British bulldog himself.
Winston Churchill,
Oh my goodness.
who we will, and we're going to go back to another Candace Millard story because it was a fascinating read, but this is about Winston Churchill and his escape from a prison during the Boer Wars.
Now, they didn't call it the Boer War because it was
Yeah.
boring, ladies and gentlemen. This is a very exciting war. Just the people they were fighting in South Africa were the Boers.
That's right. So we'll be back soon with another episode. Thank you all for listening. Hopefully we didn't abuse you too much. And David has one last comment.
Well, I feel vindicated, first of all. But second of all, if you like this, tell your friends. And if you hated this, tell your enemies.
That's
Why
right.
should you be the one to suffer? Good night.
That's right.
Well, I'm not a crook.